Wie könnte eine Welt aussehen, wo jeder Mensch sich selbstbestimmt bilden kann? Wie müsste Bildung aussehen, dass die Menschenrechte von jungen Menschen geachtet werden bezüglich ihrer Bildung? In meinem Podcast unterhalte ich mich mit Menschen über selbstbestimmte Bildung. I'm honored to have Peter Gray as a guest today. Peter, you are a research professor in the Boston College, and you specialize in the nature and the value of play.
Yes.
And you defined the term self-directed education. I'm looking forward to speaking about self-directed education with you and play and everything around that. Maybe let's start with this. What is self-directed education?
So self-directed education fundamentally is education that is initiated and controlled by the person being educated. So it's I guess maybe I need to back up and say, so first of all, what is education? So education in my definition is really everything that a person learns that enables them to live a satisfying and meaningful and moral life. I think that's what we all want from education, no matter how we conceive of education. So it's not everything you learn. You can learn bad habits, you can learn trivia, you can learn things that aren't true, and so on and so forth. But it is everything that you learn that helps you in life. That's the way I would define education. So education kind of has a halo around it. It's a good thing, right? We all want to be educated. So when people say they're unschoolers, that doesn't mean that they're not that they're against education. Nobody's against education, at least the way I've defined it. So that's what education is. Now, I think that most of us, no matter how much schooling we had, if we think about education as defined that way, everything that we've learned that enables us to live a satisfying and meaningful and moral life, I think all of us would have to say that a great deal of that, almost certainly most of it, is stuff we did not learn in school. It's stuff that was not forced upon us. It was something that came out of our everyday life, just in the process of living. And it was something that came out of our own, sometimes conscious, desires to learn something that was meaningful to us or to engage in some activity that was meaningful to us. And in the process, we learned a lot doing it. So really, one can think of education as really self-directed education is all of that aspect of education that isn't forced upon us, that isn't coerced, that isn't the result of somebody telling us this is what you've got to do. Self-directed education it's not normally a big part of it, but it can include organized courses if the person chooses them, if the person is free to join them and free to quit if they feel it's not helping them or not interesting to them any longer. So it doesn't preclude joining an organized course, but my experience is that most people involved in self-directed education don't spend a lot of time in organized courses. So that now, all that being said, I should say that I have used a kind of terminology in which I distinguish between self-directed education with small letters and self-directed education capitalized, where the S, D, and E are capital letters. So when I'm talking about self-directed education with small letters, I'm talking to something that every human being is involved with essentially all the time. When I talk about self-directed education with capital letters, I'm referring to the situation where a person, normally a child, a person of schooling age, is not going to a compulsory school where all of that person's education is coming from self-directed education. They are not being subjected to a forced curriculum. So somebody who is in self-directed education, by that definition with capital letters, might be homeschooled by the method commonly called unschooling, where there's no forced curriculum. The child can pursue their own interests, and the parents and others enable the child, help the child do that. Or the the child might be attending a democratic school that is designed for self-directed education, where there's no imposed curriculum, but there is lots of opportunity for learning, including adults that one can go to if they wish, for help and advice.
I think this is really important, like to establish what we are actually talking about, because I noticed that in practice, a lot of people confuse these terms, and I notice that more and more people talk about self-directed education, but actually are not talking about what you just described.
Right.
What would you maybe like to establish another term define as play?
So play, I actually have a somewhat formal definition of play. Play is an activity that involves the following four characteristics. The first characteristic is that it is self-chosen and self-directed. So it's something that the person, normally when I talk about play, I'm talking about children, so I'll use the word children here, but adults can play too. It's something that the child chooses to do. Nobody is making the child do it or coaxing the child to do it. The child chooses to do it. And the child is in charge of the activity. The child determines how to do it. I should qualify that by noting that children most often prefer to play together with other children. So when they're playing socially, then they have to decide together what they're doing, and they have to decide together how they're doing it. So play is how children learn to compromise, negotiate, work together as a team when they are choosing what to play, what the rules are, and so on and so forth. So that's the first definition. It is something chosen and directed by the players themselves, not by some outside authority. So right off, you can, by this definition, if a teacher stands up in front of a classroom and says, now children, we're all going to play this, then you know it's not play, right? This was not something that was initiated by the child. So the second part of the definition, the second characteristic, is that it's intrinsically motivated. What that means is that you're doing it for its own sake. You're not doing it for some reward outside of itself. You're not doing it to get a high grade on a report card. You're not doing it to get a trophy, or not getting it to get gold stars, or for money, or for praise from some authority figure, or to improve your resume. You're just doing it because you want to do it. The third characteristic is that play is always structured. There's no such thing. People talk about unstructured play. There's no such thing as unstructured play. Play is never random. When you are playing at something. You've got something in your mind that you're doing. There's some structure to it. That structure comes from within the minds of the players. It may be that they've just chosen to follow rules that are already established. That's fine. That's still play. That's still rules. But they may be creating their own rules, or they may be modifying the rules. But play has rules, it has guidelines, it has structure. You're doing something. You're making a sandcastle. You're not just piling up sand randomly. You're pretending to be a giant. You're not just randomly acting. You're doing something that is bounded in a certain way. There's certain ways that you've got to control your behavior in a structured way in order to be playing. So that's the third characteristic. And the fourth characteristic is that although play has structure, it has rules. Those rules always leave a great deal of room for creativity. There's always, on every move in play, you've got choices to make. You've got decisions to make. You can go this way or you can go that way. So although there's guidelines that keep you within this world of whatever it is you're playing at, there's lots of room for creativity. And in fact, I've often argued, and I think it's true, that play is the most creative thing that anybody ever does. Play is always creative. And especially for young children, it is usually very imaginative. There's a highly imaginative component to play, a lot of pretend, a lot of fantasy involved in play. So play is exercising our ability for the child's ability for imagination and the child's ability for creativity.
Yeah, I remember very well when I still worked as a music teacher. I came across your research and research of some other people like Alan Thomas or Harriet Pattison. And it struck me that in practice, what we were taught to do in an institution like that absolutely was opposed to everything I actually felt. And so your research was really helpful to me to have something that was actually aligned with what I could observe with my students and how I learned myself. And it also kind of explained why all the coercive methods didn't work. And since then, it's quite a conundrum for me. Why did we create structures that are actually, I would say, hostile to learning?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So if you go back far enough in human history, if we were to go back to hunter-gatherer days, and the only way we know this is by looking at those groups of people who survived as hunter-gatherers into rather recent times and were studied by anthropologists, they did not create such structures. The assumption among them was that children would learn on their own. They might do a little bit of teaching, like, those mushrooms are poisonous, don't eat them. Something that you wouldn't want the child to learn by trial and error. But other than that, the assumption is children are going to learn. They've got eyes, they've got ears, they've got brains, they pay attention, they absorb what's around them. They want to do well in the world, so they want to learn what they need to do well, and they will take the initiative. And if they need help, they'll ask for help, or they'll come around and in one way or another show us that they're looking for some help with this or that. That's the assumption. That was always the assumption until relatively modern times. But we went through a period of history where these natural ways of human living became a problem to much of society. Once we had agriculture and then subsequently industry, we didn't necessarily need, but we created a world in which most people, needed to survive by becoming the employees, if not the slaves, of those people who had wealth and land. The society changed in a way that we lost the idea of equality. We lost the idea that everybody is equal in this society. Everybody should have the same opportunities and the same amount of goods, and it's not appropriate to hoard things. You share everything. That was the way of hunter-gatherer living. But once we went to agriculture, then people kind of had to own the land that they farmed and keep other people away from it. Otherwise, they'd be doing all this work and other people would just take it. So you began to have land ownership. And once you had land ownership, then at some point, pretty much all the land in the area was already owned. So if you didn't own land, the only way you could survive was to work for somebody who did own land. So now you were not so much your own person anymore. Now you were somebody dependent upon somebody else who owned the land, and you had to do what they asked you to do. You couldn't really make a choice. So we went from a world where there was a lot of free choice to a world where most people had to be obedient to the people who were in authority in order to make a living. Ultimately, this resulted throughout Europe and Asia in feudal societies where the great majority of people were beholden to a very small number of kings and lords who owned everything. And so everybody, their livelihood, their lives depended upon obeying the instructions that were given to them. So under those conditions, no surprise, the primary lesson that parents had to teach their children was obedience. Because if you grew up not obedient, if you grew up feeling like I don't have to do what the people in authority are telling me to do, if it doesn't make any sense to me, or if it isn't to my benefit to do it, your life would be at risk. They might just kill you, or at minimum, they'll stop feeding you, right? So the system of raising children to obey became the prominent. I mean, even if you read the Christian Bible, the Jewish Bible too, both Old and New Testament, the primary instructions to child raising is to beat your child. That's about all you hear, right? Is to beat your child. If the child doesn't do what the father tells, the child should be beaten, if not killed. So these are so we can get, even by reading the Bible, which is a historical text in a sense, we get an idea of what the child raising philosophy was at that time. This was entirely the opposite of the child raising philosophy of hunter-gatherers. So the result of this was that once we had schools, no surprise, the primary purpose of schools was to teach obedience. It almost didn't matter what was being taught. By the time we had schools run by the Protestant churches, which were really the origin of schools, as public schools as we know them today, came out of the Protestant Reformation. The Protestants believed that it was important for everybody to read the Bible directly rather than to get it from the hierarchy of a church. So it became important that everybody be able to read. So that was one of the purposes of the early schools, was to teach reading so people could read the Bible. But even more important was that people believed the Bible, so indoctrination and biblical doctrine, but topping all of it was obedience, because the belief was that really free will is the work of the devil. Children are born in sin. Children are naturally sinful. And that sinfulness more or less has to be beaten out of them, and they need to be taught to obey their Father, to obey the Lord's, to obey ultimately God, who's the Father of us all. This was a very hierarchical view of the human condition, in which the child is growing up to be fundamentally a good slave or a good employee or a good servant, not somebody who would be expected to have free will and have their own ideas and be creative and so on. and schools were developed in support of that. Now, over time, some of this has changed. We aren't quite the same hierarchical society now that we were then. And in fact, I would say that most parents, even most school teachers, don't believe that their primary job is to teach obedience today. This has changed. They don't believe it. But we haven't changed the way schools operate. We still are stuck with the same school model that was developed when the purpose was teaching obedience. The school model is that the teacher tells the children what they're supposed to do. And if the children then do it, they will pass. If the children don't do it, they will fail. So what's the primary lesson here? It's do what you're told. The only way you can pass is to do what you're told. The only way you can fail is to not do what you're told. Even during the industrial age, this was regarded by most people, at least in industry, a valuable lesson. Industry wanted people who would do what they're told, to not question authority. Do what you're told. You don't really have to think. You're going to be working on an assembly line. You're going to be doing this. Important you read a little bit. Important you have some numbers so you can do some simple calculations. But the most important thing is that you be on time and that you do what you're told to do. So that's the history that led to kind of the loss of freedom and the change in social structure and specifically in schooling, where the goal was to create obedience.
I would say this is a very inconvenient truth that you just laid out so perfectly. Yeah, it's interesting to me that we seem to believe it seems to be impossible to challenge the beliefs that we hold what actually is the purpose of schooling, and it seems to be like a fantasy that most people hold today, what school is actually about. Because I would also say that in practice it's exactly what you described. It's fundamentally that's fundamentally what is taught in mainstream and coercive schooling. But nowadays it's absolutely in opposition with like ideas like human rights or the right to education. But why can't we, or why are so few of us willing to actually change these fundamental structures?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think it's part of human nature that we are conformists. We couldn't have human society if we weren't, to a considerable degree, conformists. We look around, what are other people doing? And we're very reluctant to do things differently from what other people are doing. We may be regarded as crazy if we act differently from what other people are doing. We are creatures of norms, and to a large degree that's a good thing. We couldn't really have human society if everybody just did their own thing without regard to kind of the unity of society. And also sometimes it can be dangerous to do your own thing. There may be good reasons why everybody's doing something in the same way. In my textbook, I imagine sort of this village where you come into the village and you see that everybody in the village, when they leave the village, they cross Bridge A rather than Bridge B. And why don't they cross Bridge B? Well, there must be some reason. Maybe nobody's saying it, but you assume there's probably some danger to crossing Bridge B. So you better cross Bridge A like everybody else. I mean, that's logical, right? If nobody's crossing Bridge B, there's probably some good reason they're not doing it. So if everybody's sending their child to school, almost nobody in your world is not doing that. There must be some good reason. Nobody quite can articulate what it is, but there's got to be some good reason. And if you don't do it, Your neighbors are going to look at you and think you're strange. Why aren't you sending your child to school? You must be really risking your child. You must be a negligent parent not to be sending your child to school like everybody else. And nobody wants to be seen as strange or weird or abnormal. At least most of us don't. And so that's part of it. And this has been going on now for several generations. Not only did the parents go to school, but their parents went to school, and chances are their parents went to school. So we almost believe that schooling must just be, we just automatically believe without giving a whole lot of thought, schooling must be how children grow up. They have to go to school, otherwise they're going to be homeless, or they're not going to be able to get a job, or this or that. So that's part of it. And then there's another part of it, which is that society structures things. The school system structures things, but society at large structures things such that the measures of success are hooked to schooling. So we think of a child who, let's say, if a child doesn't go, my experience is that all children, if they're growing up in a literate society, learn how to read. They all learn how to read, whether they're going to school or not. They all learn how to read. But they don't all learn how to read at the same age. And so if your child, so the school system says, by the time you're 6 years old, you should be able to read. By the time you're 7 or 8, you should be able to read well. Well, if your child is not going to school, not being forced to learn to read, it may well be that your child doesn't know how to read by that age. Many children don't get interested in reading, as Harriet Pattison discovered, until later on, and I've discovered also in some of my research with unschoolers and children at democratic schools. They all learn how to read, but they don't. But some of them don't get interested in reading until considerably later than the typical age for a school child to be taught to read. So when that happens, everybody says this has been a failure, or many people say this has been a failure. This person didn't go to a regular school. Here they are, 8, 9, maybe even 10 years old and not reading. So this is failure. But that's because we've set up arbitrarily measures of success that fit with the school curriculum. So I think those all contribute. And then if in addition to that, you've got the government believing that schooling is essential and is making it very difficult for you to not send your child to school, maybe possibly arresting you for allowing your child to be truant. That adds to the difficulty of making this kind of a decision. So there are many forces that are working against. So even the parent who completely has figured it out, my child would just do fine, my child would do better not going to school as long as we can find other ways to support our child's interests. They'll develop just fine. But even for that parent, it's very difficult to make the decision not to send your child to school. So a very short way of saying this is kind of its inertia. This is the way things are done. And it's hard to change when everybody's doing it, when the whole society is doing it, when the structure of society, when the laws and everything are supporting doing it in this kind of way. And then you have the belief that it's important to go to college, and the belief that to go to college, you've got to go to a regular school, you've got to get certain grades in school, and so on. All of that means that you've got to be a fairly courageous parent to make the decision not to send your child to a course of school.
Yeah, and in the end, like, if we think this through, it challenges also what comes after school.
Yes.
Because that too is structured in the way that you described why we have school in the first place. So these structures are still in place, like how we actually, do our economics, how do we organize work, and why are we organizing work like that, or how are we growing food? It's kind of similar structures, I would say.
That's exactly right. But what's interesting and why I think that we are now at a time when this is beginning to change. We're seeing in the United States, at least, we're seeing more and more people not sending their children to regular school. The rates of homeschooling are greatly increasing. And I think that one of the reasons for the change is that actually the society and the economic structure is changing in certain ways. The kinds of jobs that required kind of mindless rote activity, that mindless calculations, mindless assembly line work, and so on, and just obedience, those jobs are disappearing if they haven't already disappeared. What the economy needs now, because we've got computers, we've got robots, really to do pretty much all of the non-creative work. What the economy needs now, what businesses are looking for now, is people who are creative, people who can think outside the box, people who can solve new problems. We more and more in this world today, you almost have to be an entrepreneur. You almost have to be somebody who can learn on the job. What you need to know keeps changing. You almost have to be somebody who can, because we're moving towards the gig economy as opposed to regular employment. You almost have to be an entrepreneur. Almost have to be able to do this thing that I said is part of play, figure out, initiate what I want to do, and then how do I do it, and how can I make a living doing it, you have to add. So that's becoming more and more part of the world we live in. My observation in research on grown unschoolers, graduates of democratic schools, is that they're doing very well in the world. And I think because of the fact that the creativity hasn't been drilled out of them, the desire to learn, their willingness to learn in the job, the desire to take charge of their own life, rather than to be just follow the instructions of others. One of the things we hear from employers these days is they want to hire people who can figure out how to solve problems. They're getting too many young employees who just want to do what they're told to do because that's what they're used to in school. But the employers are saying, I hired them to figure out how to do it. It's not for me to figure out how to do it. It's for them to figure out how to do it, whatever the task is that they're being hired for. And so employers are looking for people who want to take charge and figure out things and do things their own way, as long as they're doing the production that's part of the job that they're hired for. So I think that the economy is changing in some ways. And so for the first time in centuries, we are now in a world that is rewarding creativity more than it is rewarding blind obedience.
I would say this is also true in other structures that we have, other also big challenges that we face, like with climate change and how are we growing food, and
Yes.
and it seems to become clearer and clearer that the promise of the ideas that we have been told so long are not really true. They are not holding up.
Right. That's right. I think there's a growing recognition that we've got to make some really major changes, or the world is going to become inhabitable for human beings. Maybe not for you and me, but maybe our grandchildren will be born into a very, very different and less benign earth than we have now or have had in the past.
So you explained a lot of where the theoretical framework, but all this is based in observations you made, people actually living this. This is not a theoretically utopia that you are describing, but
Right.
there are places that are actually doing it. Can you talk a little bit about how did you come across this idea?
Yeah, I began to become interested many, many years ago when my own son was young and had been rebelling in school. He had been rebelling in the typical suburban public school that he was attending from kindergarten on through fourth grade. And he was dispositionally the kind of person who really didn't could not do things that didn't make sense to him. He kind of had to be in control of his own decisions in his own life. And so he really hated school. He rebelled continuously in school. And it reached a point where it was very clear that we would have to find some alternative for him. At that time, homeschooling was very little known, relatively little known. It was almost only fundamental Christians who did homeschooling. There was very little secular homeschooling going on. And we were not really in a position to do homeschooling. So we looked for some alternative school, and what ultimately we found was the Sudbury Valley School, which was turned out to be only a couple of miles from where we lived. And when we visited this school, my son said, this is exactly what a school should be. In his opinion, he was very immediately happy with the school. He said, if this is all true, if this isn't a mirage, this is what a school ought to be. And so he enrolled there and was happy. And I was happy that the brightness returned to his eyes and he was no longer angry as he was before so much of the time. He was clearly learning at a rapid rate, all kinds of interesting things and developing well. But I was nevertheless concerned about his future because I didn't know much. This seemed like a experimental school, and I didn't necessarily want my son to be part of an experiment that might not work. So got interested in the question of what happens to the graduates of this school. Clearly, they're happy there, and that's a good thing. But what happens when they graduate? Do they go on to good careers? If they want to go on to higher education, to university, can they do that? And so I ended up doing a study of the graduates of the school at a time when the school was still relatively young, but old enough that there were some graduates who had done all of what would have been their elementary and secondary schooling there. So some of them had never taken a course. The school doesn't even offer courses, although children can get together and create a course if they want. But it only goes as long as the children want it. And so this is as different as you can imagine from traditional schooling. And so, since the belief out there in the world is that you're going to kind of be lost in the world if you don't go through traditional schooling, I was wondering about the graduates. And so we did this study, and there were already at that time something like 70 or 80 people that qualified in by our definition as graduates. I did the study along with David Chanoff, who at that time was a part-time staff member at the school, so he could help locate the graduates and help form the kinds of questions that we might ask. And so we did this study. We got the agreement of the great majority of the graduates, and the results were, in some ways, astounding to me. They were doing very well in the world. Including even if they wanted to go on to university, they did it, even though they hadn't met any of the supposed requirements for going on. They got themselves in, and they did well. They were in a whole range of careers. I was a little afraid they were all going to be starving artists of one sort or another, but no, they were people in their science. There were people in the human services. There were people in the whole range of careers that we value in the society. And so this allowed me to relax as a parent. I didn't have to worry, as I was before, that his future might be limited because of not going to a typical school. But more than that, it also really was intriguing to me. Obviously, these people, by any meaningful definition of education, they were leaving the school well educated. They had gone on to meaningful and satisfying, and as far as I could tell, moral lives. And so they were educated. So, how did they become educated? And so that led to some further observational research. Another a graduate student and I did studies of in which we spent a lot of time. The graduate student spent much more time than I did at the school, making observations about age mixed interactions. What are the kids actually doing while they're there? And really developing, and that's really where I developed an appreciation of play. You could look and you could say, well, they're just playing. But when you look more closely and you see what play is and you see what's happening in play, and you begin to, then it becomes less surprising that they're becoming educated, that they're really doing very sophisticated things in play. And it's very clear that they're learning a lot in play. And the other aspect of the school that I began to really see as crucial to why it works so well is the age mixing. So children there are not segregated by age. There are children there from age 4 on through late teenage years. The whole school range of ages are there. And they're not separated from one another. They interact all the time at will. And the founder of the school, Danny Greenberg, had always said that age mixing was the key to why the school works so well, because the younger kids are always learning from the older kids. And the older kids, in other ways, are learning from the younger kids. And he would say that if you tried to make a school like this and everybody within a couple of years of the same age, it wouldn't work because, I mean, just to take a simple example, if you've got a school that's all little kids and nobody knows how to read, nobody's going to learn how to read. But if you've got a school where some of the kids are a little older and they already know how to read, the little kids are learning how to read from the older kids, not because the older kids are deliberately teaching them, but because they're playing games that involve reading, because the older kids can read, the little kids want to read, they want to be like the older kids. So the older kids are constantly drawing the younger ones up into higher levels of activity just by virtue of their doing these higher levels of activity. I'm convinced that little kids pay more attention to what kids a little older than themselves are doing than to what adults are doing. Adults are kind of in a whole different world. But if I'm 4 or 5 years old and I see these really cool 7 and 8-year-olds doing these things, then I want to do them too. They're not so different from me. They're not so far advanced from me that it precludes my belief that I could do that if I tried. And so age mixing was clearly a key to it. So that initial experience of finding that this worked led to my interest in how does it work? And that in turn led to an interest in play as a vehicle for learning, play and curiosity, I might add, as vehicles for learning, and also then thinking about the setting for learning, and including the idea of age mixing, that the ideal setting is one where the child is exposed to other children over a wide range of ages.
Like nowadays, like maybe to round this up, like a look in the future and also in the present. So we are both involved in different initiatives that try to raise awareness about all of this, about play, about the importance of play, about the importance of consent and all this stuff. And I just came across a workshop you did at the last Aero conference that was kindly shared with me, where you proposed some ideas how we actually could, what we could do. Yeah, if you like, maybe we could talk a little bit about what we can actually do now, right now, to actually change this paradigm, I would say.
Right, right. So, I think so. Thinking about what this as I said in that talk, we're already changing. We're changing gradually, but a little bit more rapidly than in the past. More and more, at least in the United States, more and more people are beginning to homeschool, and homeschooling is the first step to self-directed education for most people, because once you've got your children at home, even if you think you're going to enforce a curriculum, you end up modifying it. You end up realizing, I don't want to fight with my child. Why should I make my child read this book because it's in the curriculum when my child really wants to read that book? Why not let them read what they want to read? They learn much more when they're doing what they want to do. So you begin to realize that you're not going to teach a rigid curriculum, and you gradually loosen up. And in many families, it loosens up to the point, and then they just hear the word unschooling and they think, well, that's what I'm doing is unschooling. And they begin to think, well, this is a thing, this is okay. And so homeschooling kind of leads a fairly high percentage, and I think a growing percentage of people who homeschool end up feeling like my job is not to impose a curriculum, force a curriculum on my child. My job is to enable my child to do the things that my child's interested in doing, and they will learn as they're doing that. They will develop what they need to know. It's also my job as a homeschooling parent to find the kind of environment, including opportunities for the child to make friends, and ideally across a range of ages, to provide those kinds of conditions. And as more and more people are homeschooling, it becomes more and more easy to do that. You can link up with other homeschoolers, you can create learning centers, you can have days in the park where the children just play, and so on and so forth. So it becomes easier and easier to do it. The other thing that's happened with time is that the internet has made everybody realize you don't have to go to a school to find information. Information is very readily available. You can find whatever you want to know on the internet. You have to be kind of selective and so on, but that's true no matter how you're learning. So there's a lot of reasons why it's much easier to do self-directed education today than it was in the past. So I guess the things that I was trying to emphasize, if we want to move this revolution along faster, how can we do it? One thing we need to do is to do a better job than we are already of getting this out to the public, letting people know this works, letting people know there's a lot of people doing this. I think that what I was trying to encourage, I think that quite properly, most people who make a decision about their own children, to take their child out of school and do something different, they're doing it for the sake of their child. They're not doing it for the sake of improving the world or improving other children. They're doing it for the sake of their child. And that's what they're thinking about. So they're not thinking that this is part of a movement and I should be working for the movement. This is not like a liberation movement in their mind. This is just something I'm doing for my child. And they're not even necessarily thinking this would be good for every other child. They're just thinking this is really what my child needs. So I think that we need to change the thinking of people who are doing this. We need to change the thinking kind of in the same way. If you think about other liberation movements, women's liberation, for example, it wasn't just, I want to liberate myself. It was, I want to change the world so women in general are more liberated. And men got on board who believed in this too and tried to make changes such that women were no longer slaves to their husbands, right? And that, and when in the United States, the civil rights movement, people who were African American in ancestry who had originally been enslaved, but now were very discriminated against, even by the laws in many states, let alone by. So we needed a liberation movement for people of color, and it's still going on. Of course, it hasn't totally succeeded, but a lot has changed. So we need to start thinking about a liberation movement for children. And my argument there was that everybody who has found that this works for their own child ought to be looking into the evidence that it also works for other children, and also then ought to be playing their role in making this more possible for more people. And one way you can play that role is by clearly coming out of the closet. I'm doing this. Let everybody know that you're doing this and that it's working. And, so the more everybody's involved, hold book clubs in the library where people can read books about this and learn about it. And you don't have to call it a book club on self-directed education, just call it a book club on child development, but include some books about how children learn, and it's an educative thing. So and people who are doing this, get a little, if your child does something interesting that might be newsworthy, get the local weekly newspaper to do a little article on it, get it out there. So we need to do a better job of publication. We need to enlist at a ground level everybody who recognizes that this works for their child to also think about it working for other children and to feel some commitment to helping make it work for other children. So that's one thing. And then another thing is we need, I think the biggest practical constraints on self-directed education are money and the opportunities for children to develop, to have a lot of free activity with other children over an age mixed time. So, when you send your child to school, there's a lot of other children there. They don't have a lot of time to play and do much together, but at least there's other children there. And if you're not sending your child to school, especially in this day and age where people are generally not sending their child outdoors, it's hard for children to make friends in this world. Then how do you provide this really important ingredient to self-directed education with the child's opportunity to have a lot of friends, have friends who are of various ages, have friends that they see regularly, that they do things together with, that they have to learn how to get along with, and so on and so forth. How do you create that? So another thing that we need to do is to create these kinds of opportunities. One place that, and we can do that by working with parks departments. We can do that by changing what's happening in our neighborhood, getting parents together to send their kids outdoors and so on. But another thing we might do is to work with libraries. I did, along with 2 librarians, did a survey of libraries in the United States. We did it just before the COVID pandemic, so we had to cut it short a little bit, and we didn't get as many libraries as we hoped, but we ended up surveying 50 libraries across the country of various sizes. And what we found is that most of the libraries had opportunities for play at the library, and including for older children. Many of the libraries in the United States now have maker spaces in them. These are places with high-tech equipment for like 3D printers and laser cutters and so on and so forth. And these are very attractive to children. This is a kind of constructive play, and it brings people into the library who are fiddling with this and learning how to do it, and they get to know one another. So this is an opportunity for play at the library, that libraries are recognizing the value of this, and more libraries are doing it. A lot of libraries now have teenage hangout rooms in the library where kids can come in. Mostly this is kids after school, but homeschool kids come in. They can be in there, they can listen to music, they can talk with one another, they can play games, including computer games. They can do all the things teenagers need opportunities to get together with other teenagers away from adults, and libraries are increasingly providing that. So one of my proposals was that people who are interested in promoting self-directed education get involved with their local libraries and help the libraries move even further in this direction. Ultimately, I think libraries could become the replacements for coercive schools. The long tradition of libraries is that they are places for self-directed education. You go to the library and they don't tell you what to read. They help you find what you want to read. They don't tell you what you should learn. They help you learn what you want to learn. So librarians are trained in a way to be facilitators for self-directed education. And they are now, many librarians, not all of them by any means, are beginning to recognize that this function should go beyond helping out with media and books, helping out with other things. So ultimately, I could imagine a situation where libraries become kind of like Sudbury schools, become kind of like democratic schools. You could have adults there who are responsible just to make sure that the kids are safe. And you could send your kid to the library for the day while you go off to work. And you could rest assured it'll be safe enough. There are lots of interesting things to do. There are a lot of kids there at the library. And you can pick up your kid at the end of the day, or they can bicycle home at the end of the day if they're allowed to bicycle without you picking them up. So I would love to see. I mean, at least in the United States, I assume this is true in Germany and most other places. There are libraries, almost as many libraries as there are schools. There's libraries in every community. The infrastructure is there. Libraries don't need as much space as they used to need for storing books because the internet has kind of replaced the need for lots of books and other kinds of media. And libraries want to continue to be relevant. And so they're learning that they can be relevant by serving more purposes to the community. So so one thing that I think that people who want to promote this movement can do is become involved with the library and help the library make these kinds of steps that I've just been describing, and to go even further in that direction. So those are some of the things that I described. Now, the other thing that is a constraint for many people is financial. So public schools, sending your child to the coercive public school is free. If you're not sending your child to the coercive public school, you're paying the same taxes for that, but you're not getting any of the benefit from it. And so that's discouragement for a lot of people to do it. And many people can't really afford to do it. If both parents need to work, or if there's only one parent and that parent needs to work outside of the home, especially for young children, you really can't do homeschooling. Unless you've got some kind of a cooperative arrangement with other parents, which some people do, or you've got grandparents around or something like that who can help out. But for many people, it seems to preclude their being able to do homeschooling. But if you could provide, if there were funds available so that you could pay even a small amount of tuition for your child to go to attend a learning center that might be for homeschoolers, then the child can be there all day long. And so although libraries might become ultimately the free place you could send your kids because they're publicly supported, but in the interim, most libraries are not going to let you send your kids there all day long, at least not young kids. And there's not going to be a lot of other kids there, interesting things for them to do there anyway. So you want to be able to send your child to some kind of a learning center, like an agile learning center or something like a Sudbury school, but those they don't get public support. So they need you need to be able to pay for them. So one of my proposals is that what we need is we need people who believe in this movement to start donating money. We need a foundation to support families that want to do self-directed education, that provide financial support. If you can't afford to send your child to a Sudbury school, you should be able to get a scholarship that allows you to do it. But we need some kind of a foundation that raises money and gives out those scholarships, that allows families that otherwise couldn't afford to do this to be able to afford to do it. So one of my proposals was that we need somebody who's skilled at fundraising and nonprofit foundations to get a foundation going. I've been looking for somebody in the United States to get at least a foundation in the United States for US purposes going. And then we need to start fundraising. And I think just like people contribute to other movements, people contribute in the United States, people contribute to the to the NAACP, the National Association of Colored People, because they believe in the civil rights. People contribute to the American Cancer Society because they want to wipe out cancer. People contribute to the Audubon Society because they want to save wildlife. People make contributions to things that they believe in if they've got some money that they don't need for everyday expenses. They've got a little extra money, they make a contribution. We have a long tradition of that, but almost nobody's making contributions, even if they strongly believe in self-directed education, they're not making contributions for it. And part of the reason is there's nobody asking them for this. Or if they are, they're just local facilities, just the local school. But I think that we need to get people to begin to think, I'm not just giving to this local school, I'm giving to a movement. I'm giving to this movement that I believe in. And so we need an organization that's not tied to any specific school, but rather is a general organization, just like the American Cancer Society is tied to the overall problem of wiping out cancer. It's not tied to a particular hospital or a particular set of researchers. It's tied to the whole movement. And so you give to it believing I'm giving to a cause that I believe in. I've done enough research on them to know that they've got people who know where to turn this money for its best effects. And that's why I'm giving it to them. So we need an organization like that for self-directed education. So, and I think once we have such an organization, then we can start, and there are certain, in the United States, at least, there are millionaires, there are billionaires who really are self-directed. They left school to become billionaires, and they should understand that it was really self-directed education that led them to be successful. And we ought to be able to convince them to give some portion of their billions of dollars to this foundation. It would be pocket change to them, but boy, would it be meaningful to families that can't afford to go. So, but we've got nobody trying to get that money from them right now. We need a skilled fundraiser. We need a movement. We need people to begin to do that. So those are some of the things that I talked about at in that talk at the Aero conference.
Yeah, I find this really, really excellent, and it is at the heart of at least where I'm also involved, like finding ways like how can we actually build these structures and really make it clear that this is really a movement.
Right.
It is not only about individual people, but it is really about everybody. And I would even go so far and argue that as a liberation movement goes, that if we really succeed in liberating children so they can grow up actually feeling and having experienced freedom and what it means to be respected and having consent, that this is actually like a liberation movement for all liberation movements, because it concerns everybody on the planet. It's a liberation movement kind of humankind. it's
right.
We all were children, and in the end we are also liberating ourselves.
Right. It's a very good point. And we're liberating. I mean, we're so many countries right now, there's a tension between, are we an autocracy or are we a democracy? And most of us, us being probably you and me, believe that we should be a democracy. We should be a world where people have input, where people can make their own decisions, where people are not being controlled by a dictator. But if you're growing up basically controlled by a dictator, that's you're growing up kind of under an authoritarian set of assumptions about how things operate. No matter how much you might be reading about democracy in school, the fact that you're growing up in an autocracy means you're not necessarily being prepared for the task, the individual obligations as well as freedoms of being a a member of a democratic society. So I think that this is important in many ways for the future of society, the future of the world.
Yes, absolutely. Peter, thank you so much for your time and for everything that you do and all your work. And also I would highly suggest to everybody to read Peter's Substack. If you want to read it in German, you can find it. Also, I'm translating it into German, so you can find it on the link below. And I would also highly encourage to subscribe to Peter's Substack and invest some money in the good cause of liberating play for children. And I hope there will be much more research done about this, and that we will actually succeed in creating this movement and come together as a community and do this together.
Great. And thank you for having me on. Thank you for doing those translations. I appreciate that. And I can see you're sending me each one. I can't read them, but I'm glad to see that they're there and more people are reading that work. Yes. Okay. I think that this has been fun. And I do think that I think this change that we're talking about is going to occur. I believe it is. I'm optimistic. But we need to make it occur a little more rapidly than it is.
Absolutely. Dieser Podcast ist möglich dank Zuhörern wie dir. Wenn du einen einfachen Weg suchst, meine Arbeit zu unterstützen, abonniere meinen Podcast doch bei Spotify, Apple, Google oder bei meinem Telegram-Kanal whatabout.sde. Ein Review oder Teilen mit Freunden hilft auch sehr dabei, dass mehr Menschen den Podcast finden können. Ich freue mich auch über jede finanzielle Unterstützung, entweder mit einer einmaligen Spende oder mit deiner monatlichen Unterstützung auf Patreon. Mit dieser unterstützt du nicht nur meine Arbeit mit dem Podcast, sondern auch alle anderen Projekte in Bezug auf selbstbestimmte Bildung, wo ich mich engagiere. Alle Links findest du in der Beschreibung. Bis zum nächsten Mal bei Wie wäre es mit selbstbestimmter Bildung?